came up subsequently to serve at UN. Now, in those days, the question that agitated us on the eve of each UN General Assembly in the State Department was not what bad things can we avoid this year at the UN. Rather, the question was, what good things can we try to achieve at the UN that will serve the American enlightened interest in peace, development, and human rights, as well as the enlightened interest of the world community. And I'm just going to mention specifically some of the things that continue to be important in the UN system that had their origins in Adlai Stevenson's 4 years. First of all, in the peacekeeping area, and we have here one of the greatest experts on UN peacekeeping in Brian Urquhart. He was then serving with Ralph Bunch in charge of peacekeeping operations. But we found ourselves dealing with the very difficult Congo crisis, which had shaken the confidence of people in Congress and in the American people in the whole idea of UN peacekeeping. Adlai Stevenson never wavered. He understood that there would be trouble spots in the world, and the best way to contain conflict was not to put in U.S. forces, certainly not to put in Soviet forces, but to put in men in blue helmets. And the whole idea of a flexible call-up system in which countries could train and equip forces for potential UN service originates in those years. And it was the first time during Adlai's tenure that the U.S. committed itself to use its military assistance program for, in part, the training and equipping of UN troops from developing countries. The future of UN peacekeeping is still at risk. There are something like 17 or 18 peacekeeping operations with over 100,000 personnel, troops, and others, and the system is overstretched. We need to show the same dedication to strengthening that peacekeeping system that was shown by Adlai Stevenson and his team. Secondly, the decade of development. During Adlai's tenure, we combined the UN Technical Assistance Expanded Program and Special Fund and built it into the UN Development Program, which continues to be one of the most successful operations in the UN system. We greatly increased its funding, and of course, under President Kennedy's leadership, we increased substantially the U.S. bilateral aid program. We created the World Food Program to provide millions, hundreds of millions of dollars a year to hungry countries, and we also launched programs through the FAO to encourage greater agricultural development in the developing world. I have in my office a treasured picture of President Kennedy meeting B.R. Sen, then Director General of the FAO. I can't think of any time since when a President of the United States has met the head of the Food and Agriculture Organization. But that indicated the commitment that under Adlai Stevenson and Jack Kennedy we had to the world hunger problem. I'd like to see that commitment renewed. We also, for the first time in history, announced that we would, through the UN and through bilateral aid, support voluntary family planning in countries which wished assistance. And this meant very specifically providing aid with contraceptives and other aids to help countries deal with the population problem. Some of you may know that between 1950 and the year 2050, the population of a number of key developing countries will have grown 10 times. That sounds like an exaggeration, but look it up. That's a UN statistic, 10 times. What are the possibilities for environmental protection, jobs, economic growth, quality of life, unless those trends are arrested? Well, under Adlai Stevenson, we took what was then the unprecedented step, something that Eisenhower had refused to do, to make U.S. funding available for family planning, and that led to the creation of the UN Population Fund a few years later. Human rights, I'll close with this. When Adlai Stevenson came to the UN with his team, we found a policy of the Eisenhower administration that we would not ratify any human rights treaty, not even the treaty outlawing slavery. Why? It was the view of the Eisenhower administration that how a country treats its own citizens is not an appropriate matter for the treaty-making power. Well, we changed that. We went up and got the Slavery Convention approved by the Senate and the Forced Labor Convention. We tried the Convention on Women's Rights, but Bill Fulbright thought that was going too far. But all of this led, a few years later, to the passage of the Genocide Convention. So we established that how a country treats its own citizens is a matter of international concern. And looking ahead, the concept of the responsibility to protect, recognizing that sovereignty does not justify a country from treating its citizens in any way that it chooses, and that the international community has a valid interest. This is a concept which had its seeds in Adlai's years. I close with something that's rather risky to do. What would Adlai say about the future? Because we're asked to talk about the future. What would he advise President Obama? Well, I'm fairly confident he would say, let's restore American leadership in nuclear disarmament. For heaven's sakes, get the Senate to ratify the comprehensive test ban. For heaven's sakes, let's ratify the Law of the Sea Treaty. Let's go into Copenhagen with a good domestic bill on climate change to give credibility to the United States. And let's finance fully the UN system and start paying our dues at the beginning of the year, not 9 months late. I think I can say with confidence, those are some of the things that Adlai Stevenson asked us to do.
Thank you, Richard, very much. And now it's my special pleasure to introduce Judge Alvin Liebling, a retired U.S. Administrative Law Judge and editor of Lasting Legacy. Judge Liebling met Adlai Stevenson in 1947, Adlai Stevenson's second in 1947, as an undergraduate at Northwestern. He headed an Illinois college student campaign for Stevenson for governor in 1948. In 1954, he became assistant state attorney, and in 1956 and 58 in Washington, a special attorney with the Department of Justice, and in Chicago, an assistant U.S. attorney. In 1980, he taught environmental law at Northwestern. In 1991, he became a U.S. Administrative Law Judge assigned to Social Security's Office of Hearings and Appeals in the Chicago area. He is currently engaged in government regulatory matters in Illinois and Chicago. Judge, it's a delight to have you here, and thank you for all of your work in getting us together.
Ambassador Wolf and Pickering, good afternoon to you all. And I also want to express my great appreciation to Millie Myers for the wonderful job she's done in assembling all of us here today and facilitating it. As editor of the book Adlai Stevenson's Lasting Legacy, recently published in softcover by Palgrave Macmillan of New York City, I wish to thank U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice, for inviting us, and all of you for coming to this extraordinary symposium on the continuing influence of one of the most enduring public figures of our time, Adlai E. Stevenson II. This occasion is a tribute to United Nations Day, just a few days ago, and its staff, and to Adlai Stevenson's record as a founder and one of the most illustrious permanent representatives of that organization. In between, he became Illinois' 31st governor and twice the Democratic Party's presidential nominee, has been mentioned. Indeed, in 1945, he was spokesman for the U.S. State Department in San Francisco and the London Organizing Conference. Brian Urquhart was there, and he can talk to us about that. He returned to the UN for 4.5 years in 1961 as U.S. ambassador, inclusive of the harrowing days of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, in which he played a key role with the Kennedy administration in helping to defuse. Historian and presidential assistant Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. called the crisis the most dangerous moment in the history of man, the planet itself being put into jeopardy. Indeed, it was Adlai Stevenson's impromptu task to rise with utmost candor and diplomatically challenge Soviet Union UN Ambassador Valery Zorin to admit that atomic-tipped missiles were being installed in nearby Cuba, of imminent and substantial threat to the United States and the Western Hemisphere, and to state that he would be willing to wait, quotes, until hell freezes over for a response, close quotes. Whereupon, with prior presidential consent, he motioned for a montage of secret U-2 pictures to be wheeled into the Security Council, close by here, in support of the charge. Stevenson did not gloat over this. Rather, he proclaimed, "Let it be remembered, not as the day when the world came to the edge of nuclear war, but the day when men resolved to do nothing thereafter, to stop themselves in their quest for peace." Former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Richard Gardner, at my side here, says that between these years, it contains lessons the new administration may now utilize in its UN activities, which brings us to the title of this symposium, Adlai Stevenson and the United Nations Future. The introduction to the book I edited defines the legacy of Adlai Stevenson in the context of the nuclear age as a demonstration of the absolute value of patient international collaboration in resolving the myriad of perplexing challenges to world peace that he faced, and with it, providing America in a position of strength the opportunity to foster freedom among others by our example and assistance, not impatient arrogance, productive of resentment and resistance. Now, that generally describes the outlines of the United States approach taken by successive administrations until 2001. And since then, we have been desperately needing its return for use in Iraq, Iran, Korea, and elsewhere, and for continuing combating terrorism and satisfying international human and environmental needs, and achieving nuclear nonproliferation and retrieval of fissionable materials, nuclear disarmament, and a continued ban on nuclear testing, the last mentioned being the stimulants for nonproliferation acceptance. The book I refer to is accordingly about the current and future relevancy of international consensus building, to which we have now returned, including use of the venue calculated for that purpose by Stevenson and his compatriots, the United Nations. It contains a dozen interrelated chapters by statesmen, scientists, and co-workers who served with him, including the panelists present here. Also included is an essay by the governor himself revealing why he had urged against ferocious opposition adoption of a ban on further hydrogen bomb testing during his presidential campaign of 1956. 2 years later, President Eisenhower adopted and even expanded upon it in a comprehensive testing moratorium. And in 1963, with Stevenson's help at the UN, a treaty banning all above-ground nuclear testing was finally signed, then a non-proliferation treaty in 1968, and finally a comprehensive treaty extended to underground activity, as now in Iran and North Korea, in 1996. The last mentioned treaty, as physicist Sidney Drell and former Ambassador James Goodby remind us, contained important inspection rights, but it is not yet totally ratified, as you've heard, with China awaiting our lead. All NATO countries have ratified it, also Russia, but we have not.